Welcome to another episode of Mythbusters. We are going to look at common narratives around Bitcoin and try to find out whether or not those hold true. Now in this episode we are going to look at dollar strength, US dollar strength relative to Bitcoin's performance. Is it true that when the dollar is weak that Bitcoin tends to appreciate and vice versa? How much of a connection can we actually see in the short term, in the medium term, in the long term? Because the long-term target of every investor should be to have a diversified portfolio. Thus, we should figure out what's the connection actually between traditional finance and the crypto world. What we see over here in the top in green is the DXY. This is the dollar strength index. So whenever this is high, you can buy a lot of international currency for the US dollar. Whenever this is low, then it becomes rather expensive for Americans to travel around the world. Now what we see here in the bottom, this squiggly line in white, that's the daily correlation coefficient to Bitcoin. Now, when this is at 0, it means that the two assets are not correlated in any way, as in one asset might go up and down, the other asset might go up and down as well, and there's no real connection between the two. Whenever the correlation coefficient is at 1, it means the two assets tend to move in sync with one another. Whenever it's at -1, it means that the two assets tend to move in opposite directions. So say Bitcoin goes up and the dollar strength index goes down. That's the common narrative. Now in the data, we do not see this, at least on a daily time frame, right? We do not see how this line is low, how it's close to -1. We just see how this is randomly squiggling around. So in the short time frame, there seems to be no connection between dollar strength and Bitcoin. Now, how about the weekly ticks? So now we're looking at weekly performance. And again, we've got our correlation at the bottom. And again, we don't really see a clear direction. We don't see how Bitcoin tends to go up when the dollar strength goes down and vice versa. We simply see how those two assets seem to have no real connection to one another. But what about the long term? Maybe there is a connection on the monthly time frame, right? If we have a diversified portfolio and the dollar is going down, do people flee into Bitcoin? Again, the answer is no, right? This is a pretty nicely oscillating curve around 0. Now, how does positive correlation actually look like in the data? So when you've got two assets that tend to move in the same direction at the same time. Let's have a look at the S&P 500 versus the NASDAQ, so two types of stock indices. Let's then afterwards look at Bitcoin relative to Ethereum, so the two leading cryptocurrencies. In both scenarios, we should see positive correlation. So over here, we've got the S&P 500 and at the bottom, we've got the correlation to the NASDAQ. And this is a daily time frame, and pretty much most of the time we are above 0. We are oscillating somewhat, but we tend to be above 0. This is very different to the DXY relative to Bitcoin. So stocks tend to move in the same direction at the same time, no matter if you have just general stocks or technology stocks. Now here's the same kind of chart, but this time on a weekly time frame. Again, we tend to be at the top. This vertical line here, by the way, is the launch of Bitcoin. And again, here we've got the same, this time on a monthly time frame. And we rarely saw a disconnect between the S&P 500 and technology stocks. We only saw that for a brief period of time in 2016 when there wasn't much movement at all. But most of the time we hover around 0.7, 0.9. Currently it's very, very high at 0.95. Now let's go to the crypto world. Let's look at Bitcoin relative to Ethereum's returns. This is again the daily correlation, and we can see in the early days when Ethereum was still very small, there wasn't that much correlation, right? We tended to just hover around 0. But then as Ethereum grew and its market cap got larger, the correlation also tended to be mainly positive, right? Most of the times we are above 0. Here's the same on a weekly time frame, and here's the same with monthly returns. Recently on monthly returns, the correlation is almost perfectly at 1. So really, there's very little diversification benefit of owning both Bitcoin and Ethereum. Here's the problem with crypto YouTube. People promoting becoming degen or buying 100x coins. That's what gives clicks, but that's not what's going to bring you forward. I refuse to take money from centralized exchanges. I refuse to take money from crypto projects. I refuse to pump and dump a coin and filling up my pockets in the background. I don't do any of this. Instead, I share my knowledge in the form of tutorials in the premium membership. So that's content that won't do well on YouTube, but that builds up skill over time. You can also directly contact me over there. You can directly pick my brain. Feel free to check it out. TheBitcoinStrategy.com is the link. Now those kind of results are no real surprise. If we stay within the same ecosystem, if we stay within the stock market or we stay within the crypto market, we tend to see high correlation. And once we cross the different asset classes, we tend to see lower correlation. And it appears as if the drivers of dollar strength are very different to the drivers of Bitcoin returns. Again, because the correlation is very low. So you cannot hedge against a potential dollar weakness by owning Bitcoin. The drivers of performance of both asset classes are very different. Now there is somewhat of a connection between traditional finance and Bitcoin, and that connection is within technology stocks. It's not obvious and it's not a strong connection, and it's just recently developing, but I do believe it exists. So what we've got over here is the Bitcoin price, and at the bottom the correlation of daily returns to the Nasdaq 100. So again, it looks like there is very little correlation, right? We are just hovering around zero. Now have a look at the same chart on a weekly time frame. Again, we tended to just go around zero, but since 2021, since the end of 2021, we tend to be above zero most of the time. Not recently, but most of the time. Now have a look at the monthly returns though. This is where I think things get interesting. Since 2020, so for more than 4 years, we have seen quite strict correlation between tech stocks and Bitcoin on a monthly time frame. So the correlation coefficient was between 0.6 and 0.95. Currently, we are at roughly 0.9. So it's not an obvious connection. The day-to-day activity can be very different for Bitcoin relative to tech stocks. But when we zoom out a little bit, when we look at the monthly movements, when we look at the macro, then it does look like both assets are traded in a similar fashion. As in, if people want to get risk on, they buy both tech and Bitcoin, and when people are rather scared of the macro, they sell both. And that opens a potential opportunity, right? It means that when the Nasdaq is crashing and Bitcoin can still hold up, it might make sense to sell some Bitcoin and buy some Nasdaq, and vice versa. If technology stocks suddenly rally, but Bitcoin hasn't rallied yet, it might make sense to buy up more Bitcoin. Again, this doesn't work on a daily time frame, but when we see 1 or 2 weeks where we see a clear winner between the two, it might make sense to rebalance. At least that's what the data suggests. And so that's really where the connection is. It's between the risk on assets. It's not between the strength of currencies and the value development of Bitcoin. So if you hear anybody online talking about the dollar strength relative to Bitcoin, at least question that thesis, right? The data does not yet support that there is a clear connection between the two. If you found this useful, feel free to give it a like. It helps the channel grow. Feel free to also subscribe. I publish videos regularly on this channel. If you've got Telegram, feel free to join us. The link is down below. It's 100% free. Looking very much forward to chatting with you. Cheers.